welcome in New York, but welcome here and I appreciate Bear with me a minute. Hello, my name is Hickey. I'm your neighbor. I'm also a 9/11 first responder.
Hold it closer. Closer.
I'm also a 9/11 first responder and survivor. And today I'd like to tell you that this is the hardest speech I ever had to write. I wanted to tell you how proud I am of this country and all of you, and how the evil forces that struck us in the heart on this day 10 years ago intended to wound us mortally. Instead, it did the opposite. It sounds funny hearing myself coming from over there. It's weird. Sorry about that. I was there at World Trade Center when they went down, working for the FDNY. And I saw that on that day, and in the weeks and months and years that followed, instead of destroying our spirit, our country came together in prayer, mourning, and unity. America opened its heart after the death and destruction that took place at the Pentagon, in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and in the trade towers in New York City. America was attacked on that day by terrorists who hold a pure hatred for our way of life. And although we carry the wounds of that day in our hearts, we will never forget the bravery and courage of everyone who had to suffer as a result of the actions of that day. And we continue to work to become an even stronger nation and people. Today, people from all over the world come together just as we gather together here to grieve and remember and honor and respect those souls we lost that day and since. And also to remember how a nation, we stood up in defiance instead of being knocked down and permanently crippled. That evil act, that hatred against us has been turned against the perpetrators instead, because it inspired in us a spirit of unity and patriotism that transcends all racial and economic lines. Standing here, we are proof that the actions of that day has made our spirits stronger than ever.
Yes.
It's 3 pages long, so you better hold out. Sorry about that. Today I'd like to tell you a personal story about 2 experiences I had on that day that continue to stand out in my mind. The fact that any single experience of that day stands out more than others is strange to me, because that day was full of experiences that were unreal to anyone. That day was opposite of everything that consisted of a normal day. That day where massive buildings had once stood, only unbelievably small piles of concrete and steel beams remained. The very daylight had become dark. The air that we all took for granted was thick with debris and dust, making it impossible to breathe. Everywhere we looked, we saw ghostly white shapes. There was no color left. It was as if all the color and life had been destroyed in that place. Being there in that moment, the closest I'll ever come to experience what it must have been like to stand on the moon. That's going to make it easier.
Go there.
That day, shortly after both towers had fallen, the team of 9 firefighters I was with were given orders to find a way into the center of the collapsed towers, and the job of finding the FDNY command center and to help find survivors. We had no idea at that point that there were no survivors, only body parts from our fallen brothers. We proceeded to the rear of the World Financial Center and pried open the doors and climbed down 4 floors below ground to the center of the downed towers. And it was at that moment, in the midst of all the death and destruction, that I got down on my knees and said 2 prayers. One for all the innocent people who had died already, and a second for all the innocent people that were going to die as a result of the actions of evil people that day. I think about that moment of prayer almost every day of my life since. The second thing that stands out in my mind from that day happened after I became separated from my team in the thick smoke and dust. I was searching for my team in a situation where it was nearly impossible to see very clearly, much more than an arm's length in any direction. In dim light, I saw this form moving toward me. And as it got closer, I realized it was a man dressed in Middle Eastern clothes, wearing a turban. My heart pounded, and I froze where I stood, thinking he was part of the attack, possibly ground forces there to finish off any survivors, until I saw his face more clearly and noticed that his white, dusty face was streaked with tears. He was a local shopkeeper who had survived. He was carrying 2 cases of water looking for survivors whom I needed. All the other civilians had fled, but he stayed to help. God bless him. He was proof that the healing had already begun. 10 years have passed, and while there has been a lot of healing, there is still much to be done. There are firefighters and first responders who continue to die as a result of the attack of that day. And like my older brother Bert, who also was a firefighter and worked at the pile for 9 months afterwards, has been diagnosed with cancer and terminal lung conditions. That our government still refuses to acknowledge was caused by the air we breathe there. Our government has yet to help men with their medical issues and to provide health care that was promised to them for their heroism of that day. I hope going forward that we can all do something to change that, whether it's by writing our congressmen and leaders in Washington or just speaking up and letting them know that we need to keep their word and to help those that helped them when they needed it most. That's the end of what I've written, but there is one more thing I'd like to say. 5 years ago, my next door neighbor, John, who was a cop, told me, him and his wife told me that they were having another child. And I said, oh, that's really great. And I said, what's the due date? And he said, September 11th. And I almost fainted. And my heart broke. And I looked at him and I said, what are you going to do? You won't have a C-section maybe the day before? And he said, nope, we're hoping it's the 11th. And Molly came along on September 11th. Thank you. Give it up one more time for Sean.